Hello and welcome to podcast.init, the podcast about Python and the people who make it great. When you're ready to launch your next app or want to try a project you hear about on the show, you'll need somewhere to deploy it, so take a look at our friends over at Linode. With the launch of their managed Kubernetes platform, it's easy to get started with the next generation of deployment and scaling, powered by the battle-tested Linode platform, including simple pricing, node balancers, 40 gigabit networking, dedicated CPU and GPU instances, and worldwide data centers. Go to pythonpodcast.com/linode, that's Linode, today and get a $100 credit to try out a Kubernetes cluster of your own. And don't forget to thank them for their continued support of this show. Are you bored with writing scripts to move data into SaaS tools like Salesforce, Marketo, or Facebook ads? HighTouch is the easiest way to sync data into the platforms that your business teams rely on. The data you're looking for is already in your data warehouse and BI tools. Connect your warehouse to HighTouch, paste a SQL query, and use their visual mapper to specify how data should appear in your SaaS systems. No more scripts, just SQL. Supercharge your business teams with customer data using HighTouch for reverse ETL today. Get started for free at pythonpodcast.com/hightouch. Your host, as usual, is Tobias Macy, and today I'm interviewing Sam Scott about OSO, an open source library for managing authorization in your applications. So, Sam, can you start by introducing yourself?
My name's Sam. I'm the co-founder and CTO at OSO. We're a startup primarily based in New York, just under 10 people, but growing rapidly.
And do you remember how you first got introduced to Python?
I do. So I was originally a mathematician by training. I got introduced to Python specifically as part of like a number theory course where we used a maths package called Sage. So I had one of my lecturers was like a contributor to it and kind of used that as part of the lectures around doing some number theoretical stuff. And yeah, I loved it. It was great.
Can you start by giving a bit of a description about what the OSO project is and some of the story behind how it got started?
Yeah, sure. So as I kind of said at the beginning, OSO is a startup I'm co-founder of. The origins of OSO kind of go back almost 3 years now. My co-founder Graham and I, we sort of got together around this idea, this vision of making security more accessible for developers. That was kind of the original core idea of what we wanted to build. And what we're building for that today is this open source library called OSO, which is for building authorization into your apps. The reason we got onto authorization specifically, we went out and spoke to hundreds of different teams, engineers, security people, developers, product managers, all kinds, asking really around what they were struggling with security. Originally, we were trying to build stuff in the infrastructure space, but we kept on hearing, yeah, that stuff's important, but I just spent 6 months trying to build roles in my application. Like, does your thing solve that? First few times we're like, no, we're on the infrastructure side of things. We don't do that. And eventually we sort of realized we should maybe listen to what people are telling us is the problem and not trying to tell them.
Yeah, it's security and authorization and access control are definitely all complex problems and difficult to manage. And there have been countless attempts at doing it, quote unquote, the right way or sort of the one true way. So as you mentioned, you had this idea of it was going to be infrastructure oriented, but developers were saying, no, I'm just struggling with getting it to work on my application at all. So I'm curious, as you started to dig more into the application and software side of things, what was your kind of assessment of the current state of the ecosystem in Python or in other programming languages for being able to actually design and enforce usable policies and authorization and access controls, and what was missing in terms of the capabilities either built into the languages and frameworks or just overall sort of libraries and the ergonomics and design of these systems?
There's so many pieces to this. So I think every, I would say, web framework or application framework in general, there's often usually not built into the framework itself, but there's usually a number of packages or libraries that let you do some amount of authorization as part of that, and it's maybe better or worse integrated into the overall ecosystem. The limitation with those often tends to be that they try and enforce this kind of a single model on you. Maybe they provide something like roles, which I'm sure we'll end up speaking about later. They give you maybe like one pattern, but the thing with authorization, which is really interesting, is it's so different for every application. And like most people we spoke to, a lot of people we speak to, they're like, I'm not sure you could even solve authorization for us generically. We have this really unique situation where we need to give access to blah and blah based on this and this and this and this. So often a lot of people end up not using like libraries or frameworks and just trying to build it into their app themselves. This, becomes, spaghetti code of if statements like sprinkled throughout the app, just doing all these like small pieces of custom logic the authorization logic is both very deeply coupled with your application data, the things that people can do in your app. It is like highly different based on the application. So that was kind of the tension we were seeing, is that there's existing libraries that feel maybe too restrictive. So instead, most people are just kind of like going full ad hoc, build it themselves, refactoring multiple times a year, spending months and months and months each time being like, oh, we need this thing, and kind of reinventing it. We set out to address that problem. The original thing we wanted to do was build something that was like powerful and flexible enough that could solve like the whole spectrum of like authorization problems. I guess we'll come back to that piece later. That's where the sort of policy engine comes from, allow you to kind of represent anything. But as we started doing that, we then started realizing that there's actually maybe 80% of everybody's applications like build on the same concepts. And this is kind of coming back to those like libraries and frameworks who didn't have it so wrong in the first place. It's like, actually, most people do have like 80% the same thing. It's, roles plus some custom logic. Now we've like covered the wide spectrum. We're kind of now coming back and adding like tons of extra structure on top. So you kind of get that best of both worlds. It's like, if you do need the same pattern that most other people have, you kind of get that out of the box. But then you still have that kind of like last 20%, everyone knows the 80-20 rule, the last 20% you can still customize to your heart's content.
As far as the kind of out-of-the-box experience, is that encapsulated with those integrations that you've built for Django and SQL Alchemy and Flask that I saw when I was digging through your documentation?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Although we have probably the most, I'm not sure when this will go out, but we have like probably some of the more exciting stuff of this area coming out, within the next month or so. I think there's even more we can do. So for example, the experience we want you to have, it's like, you maybe know that you need like roles that are back in your app, and we just basically want to give you sort of almost like one line of code that allows you just to add that in your app and kind of continue moving forwards. And so we've got the beginnings of that in SQL Alchemy, but there's a lot more we want to do there.
In terms of the footguns that developers run into as they're trying to build out their own access control and authorization policies, or if they're maybe using a library or framework that's going to kind of help them aim that footgun a little bit higher, what are some of the missteps that they still might run into, or some of the common mistakes that you've seen as far as how to integrate this authorization logic within an application, and maybe some of the types of technical debt that can be accrued as a result?
I'd say there's two sides of this. I think one is the end user facing part of this, which I think is a hugely important part of authorization. And the other, as you mentioned, is kind of like the internal technical debt part of this. So I think on the user facing side, the thing that can be tempting is to be very responsive to what your customers are asking you for, and like adding new roles and new permissions and new ways to customize the like access control model to your heart's content. And then actually like creating a situation where people can break the app because they misconfigured something, and you need to explain, oh no, if you set up it this way, you can't set this configuration, and so on and so on. Like that logic starts kind of being pushed towards the user to understand. And sometimes you get those like giant pages, matrices of like permissions that you need to try and understand before you can work out how to use the app. I think that's like one of the biggest ones for me, and like the user facing side of things from like the products, is making your authorization so complex that it takes people ages to understand it. I think internally, data models are such a hugely important piece of authorization. And I've spoken about roles a lot. Roles is in theory, it's a very simple model. It's like kind of a many-to-many relationship between, say, like a user and an organization. In that way, a user can have a role in an org. Those kind of things often start out very simple, where someone might think, I just need like an admin field. A user can be an admin or not. That's a Boolean field. But then when they realize they need multiple roles, they refactor that and it becomes a string field. And then they realize they need the ability to have multiple roles in different organizations. If you're building something like GitHub with collaboration, or you need roles which don't just apply to organizations, they also apply to projects or folders or something like that, and go through these like refactoring cycles of moving from like one to many to many to many to like multiple tables, and each one can be pretty hard to do right. So that's like one of the big things that we try to address, not just in OSO, but more generally in the information we provide. We have this series of guides called Authorization Academy that basically walks you through what you need to do to build authorization to your app, not from an OSO perspective, but just like more broadly. So we talk through like, here's a roles model that you can use that will like allow you to go from like where you are today to the next 4 iterations. Skip that process and just start on the right model at the beginning.
Yeah, and even with sort of quote unquote simple role-based access control, there's the complexity of, okay, well, what happens if this person has two different roles and now I need to have a hybrid role? And, you think I just need three different roles because we have, admins, managers, and users. And then, well, okay, what if a user also needs to be able to administer things for other people on their team? So,
oh, exactly.
this sort of never-ending kind of fractal of complexity.
Yeah, that's right.
And as far as OSO itself, sort of from the 30,000 foot view, what's actually involved in getting it added into a piece of software and the kind of main types of applications that you're focusing on integrating OSO with?
The main kinds of applications we're focusing on, I would say, is your typical business-to-business, B2B SaaS application. Those are the ones where you typically need some amount of authorization from the beginning, at the very least, giving people access to different organizations and having roles and things like that within that. For that kind of an app, right, the process is like pretty straightforward. You install OSO from your favorite package manager. It's pip install OSO for Python land. You pretty much, you create an instance of the OSO objects, and you're basically now ready to start making these like is allowed calls. It's this like one interface you have to decide if something is authorized or not. That's kind of it. And it's like, all right, that's your like blank slate. I now have this like ability to do authorization. And now the way you can actually now start like implementing your logic, like deciding who can do what, is through the policy language called Polar. So this is a language we built. It's like a declarative logic-based language specifically for authorization that allows you to kind of express who can do what with like a number of rules. And this is kind of like what powers that like authorization logic of like making these decisions. And then, when I talk about some of the stuff around like, out of the box support for things like roles, those are effectively like, libraries provided for Polar that will just, take away all of that work from how you have to model the roles. It will help you do the data modeling, things like that.
How much time did you spend in the early design phases figuring out how to make YAML work for that?
How did you know? We started with JSON actually, but it's funny. V1 of this, purely in Python. That was our original like POC, very, very Python class driven. We found that it basically looked like a DSL in itself because you had to like understand all these random classes to understand how to use it. We did try and do some stuff in like a data format like a JSON or a YAML, but equally found that we had to express all these Boolean conditionals and things like that just, we were effectively trying to shoehorn a language into JSON itself. And so ultimately we landed on building a language for this, special purpose.
Yeah, it's funny how many times people start to think, I just need something declarative. I'll make it a static data structure. And then language constructs just start creeping in. And then you have to have this whole other meta language around figuring out what the data model is actually trying to tell you.
Exactly. I use GitHub Actions as an example of this a lot. Like, you have to go and look at the documentation for GitHub Actions to know what the expression syntax is. And you're not going to get, syntax highlighting or a debugger YAML file with some embedded statements. You run it through CI and and you have the slowest debugger in the world.
Exactly. Yeah. It's pretty remarkable how long some people will hang on to YAML as saying, this will work. It'll be perfect eventually.
Yep.
And in terms of the DSL, we've talked a little bit about the motivation for going down that road because, there's only so much you can cram into a YAML file. But as to the actual Polar language and the syntax, how has that expanded your scope of possibilities beyond just writing a DSL in Python or using this static data format? And what were some of the inspirations that you looked to as to how to determine the syntax and the structure of that policy language?
The reason that Polar makes so much sense over something like Python is the logic piece of it. The thing about authorization logic in particular, it tends to be a lot of like decision flow, conditionals, if the user has this role and this role allows them to do this thing and this thing belongs to this other thing, then do this, right? So typically you write this in like an imperative style language. It's a lot of like if statements and, lots of Boolean conditions and things like that. This is effectively what like logic languages are built to answer these kind of questions. The original version of Polar was basically a simple Prolog variant, Prolog being one of the sort of long-standing, well-established approaches to logic programming, used for a wide number of use cases. That was like the initial inspiration, was like building off of that. And indeed, like the first version of Polar was kind of like a very small POC put together by one of the engineers over a weekend. Just say like, hey, what do you think about this? And it was like, yes, that has like the conciseness, expressiveness that we need for representing authorization in a clean way. Now, the thing about Prolog, for those who aren't familiar with it, or maybe learn about it in like comp sci degrees, I think it often comes up. That's something people learn. The syntax isn't very friendly. It just looks weird. It's uses things like semicolons for ors and commas for ands and things like that. So it just looks very, very different. And we didn't want that to be like a barrier of people like learning, understanding this. So we sort of took the initial Prolog thing and we like iterated on a ton to try and see how we can make that more friendly. And ultimately, we sort of ended up evolving this into something that looks more like Python, right? So to do an and, you write and. To do an or, you do or. Like we don't need to save you the characters or trying to use like the glyphs and symbols to do those kind of things. So that was like a very important piece for us. Kind of the other really interesting or novel part of Polar language is that it has language semantics for host language objects. So a host language in this case being something like Python. So you run Polar embedded inside your Python application, right? So, when you're evaluating the Polar language, the rules, it's actually able to access some of the Python objects like attributes, methods, types, classes, all that kind of stuff for like how the rules are expressed and written. And so the language itself basically has those semantics. Like you can look up an attribute and it understands it's going to have to go and speak to the host language, whether it's Python or Java or Node or whatever. This like the language is built to be embedded in that way.
There's also been a kind of resurgence of policy as code in a number of different domains, most notably in kind of the cloud native area where people are using things like Open Policy Agent for being able to define who can do what on different pieces of infrastructure within a Kubernetes cluster, and policies in terms of underlying cloud platforms with IAM from AWS or various other cloud providers. And I'm curious what other types of implementations of policy frameworks and configuration dialects and ways of specifying that information that you've looked to for inspiration within your own work, either for positive inspiration or negative inspiration.
Yes, there's a few that come to mind. I think probably the original authorization policy language is one called, I'm actually not sure how you pronounce it, like Execml. It's XACML, which is kind of very XML looking kind of thing for expressing authorization logic as a policy. Very, very, very powerful, but very dense and complex and like a lot of things to try and learn. So there was also like a variant of that called Alpha, which was, kind of cleaned up syntax for the same kinds of things. Those are some inspiration. The Open Policy Agents language, Rigo, was definitely one we looked at for inspiration, but ultimately found that it wasn't so suitable for doing like application level authorization. It's more built around the model of being like a sidecar that you send data to. And whereas we really wanted that like tight integration into the application, because we felt like that's where, for a lot of authorization decisions, you need to look up data from the app, like whether the user belongs to an organization, whether the resource they're accessing belongs to the same organization. Like a lot of that information exists in the app. We wanted to make sure that our language could sort of support that like tight integration. And I think probably the other one that's worth mentioning, there's a Google project, there's a paper around this called Google Zanzibar, which is used internally at Google for doing authorization and access control for things like Google Drive and Google Docs, that kind of thing. So there, it's not really a full-on policy language, but it's some kind of like configuration language for expressing things like relationships. So those concepts like, a file belongs to a folder, a document belongs to a folder, a user assigned a role on the folder, and therefore they have a role on the file. Like it allows you to express things like mostly just in those like kind of relationship things. I think that the Zanzibar model is a very, very powerful one in terms of being able to represent that 80% I was talking about of common use cases, I think fall into that kind of bucket. And so we're sort of like trying to combine like a bunch of that inspiration. I would say it's like the power of that kind of like Zanzibar-like model, but the flexibility being able to do any kind of attribute-based controls as well, and like additional complexities for that last like 20%. Kind of want to like be able to provide all of that.
And digging more into OSO itself, can you talk through how the actual library and framework is implemented, and particularly how you manage compatibility across a number of different programming environments?
Yeah, so the language itself, Polar, is implemented in Rust. So the core of all of this is the policy language at the center. That language is built in Rust. So then we've basically exposed like a very, very simple API to the additional languages on top of it. So Python, Ruby, Java, JavaScript, TypeScript, Go, and then Rust itself as well works with this. And so those either talk through like a C-like interface or something like WASM with that like core Rust code. So like taking the Python package, we basically compile down the Rust code into like a shared library and embed that in like the Python wheels. So you can just like download that for whatever operating system. So there's like this kind of like very simple API between, now Python and the Rust Polar codes, where it kind of forms this like conversation. It's almost like an event-driven loop where the Python side of it drives the language forward. It kind of says, all right, here's my query. I want you to answer this question. And then it effectively calling like next a bunch of times to say like, all right, do a bit more work, do a bit more work, do a bit more work. The reason it does that is because Polar can respond with things like, hey, what's the value of foo on X? Hey, what's the type of X? Is X a string or is it an integer? Things like that. So they have this kind of like conversation back and forth. So Python is like driving the query evaluation forwards by calling that next API. And the Polar code is able to like ask questions back and get the information it needs to like ultimately answer the authorization questions. Every language runtime does that same kind of thing, which is really nice because like it doesn't matter if you're running in like async node worlds or you're running in Python or Python with async or in Go or in Rust or whatever, like because the host language is driving that conversation every time, we're not like depending on, there's no like background threads, there's no like message passing or anything like that. It's like purely just driven from the host language.
Yeah, it definitely sounds like it makes your life a lot easier by not having to maintain your own copy of the state and then try and reconcile that with what's running in the host runtime.
Right, exactly. We don't need to like try and call back we don't need to learn how to do a callback in every single language. The API is super simple JSON API with like a couple of methods.
And you mentioned that Polar is able to access and understand some of the methods or attributes of things like class objects in Python. And I'm curious how you handle some of the interoperability there, and particularly the policy design if you're trying to maybe make it agnostic to the host language.
I'll give you the sort of the general answer, and then I'll speak specifics about what this looks like. In general, we've actually found it somewhat rare that people really do need to share the exact same policy across multiple like applications, multiple different languages. In these worlds where you have both a Python microservice and a JavaScript microservice, and they are, managing the same data, they are answering authorization over the same things, that kind of defeats the purpose of microservices. Like often you have done the whole like splitting up, decoupling microservice approach so that you can allow them to manage different pieces of data. So in that world, it's kind of fine to have a different OSO instance on each one, because they are only speaking or doing authorization logic over the data they kind of manage. I mean, the caveat is, of course, there is going to be some amount of like shared functionality. So maybe you have a, like a user service or a user management service or something that manages all the roles. Then, each policy is probably going to want to be able to like fetch that data and do the same kind of operations over them. And basically, what you can do in that kind of world is just you can have the same like core logic shared and basically just have like a small shim on each different application to handle that like translation between the stuff that really is specific to the microservice and like the kind of same general logic. But we've also got we have this kind of model written up in Authorization Academy about doing like hybrid authorization. The idea being, again, like each microservice just manages the data that it is kind of supposed to, that it's naturally being decoupled to manage, but it kind of like exposes what it knows about the world from authorization as part of an API, so that if you have that user management service, you can just ask it questions like, I have a user, he's trying to access this resource, the resource belongs to an organization. Does the user have this permission on the organization? And then if you get back an answer, you don't need to like duplicate the same logic because the microservice did it for you. So that's kind of like the few different ways we think about this, where you can actually get pretty far with just like a single library per application approach. And anything more that gets combined, there's actually a very natural way to fit that into that sort of like microservice architecture where you get to keep the decoupling.
We've all been asked to help with an ad hoc request for data by the sales and marketing team. Then it becomes a critical report that they need updated every week or every day. Then what do? Send a CSV file via email? Write some Python scripts to automate it? But what about incremental sync, API quotas, error handling, and all of the other details that eat up your time? Today there is a better way. With Census, just write SQL or plug in your DBT models and start syncing your cloud data warehouse to SaaS applications like Salesforce, Marketo, HubSpot, and many more. Go to pythonpodcast.com/census today to get a free 14-day trial and make your life a lot easier. As far as the overall design of the system, I'm curious how the goals of the project and the actual implementation strategy has changed or evolved since you first began working on it.
Yeah, so I think the biggest one, which I kind of referred to at the beginning, was that we really started out with the sort of the most powerful OSO, the policy language that allows you to do anything. And you can pretty much implement anything with that. It's blank canvas. You can draw whatever authorization model you would like. What we've been kind of seeing more and more as we've been growing like the open source community, and we've had people come and speak to us and ask us questions about how to do X, Y, Z, is that there's actually a substantial, huge lack of information out there. The thing people often struggle with is understanding like what they should be trying to build in the first place. Not necessarily like the how is maybe they can work out, but like how should they even be thinking about this? How should they structure it? So that's what I'm talking about. 80% of things like roles and relationships, models. We basically are, evolving OSO to being able to have like a very, very clear interface for those kind of things. So basically we're taking like all the knowledge we have on authorization, everything we've learned, and giving you like an API for it. Fill out this template, fill out this spec, and you will have the role solution you need, as opposed to just being like, yeah, you can build that. Oh, you want to know how? Yeah, we'll tell you. So we wanted to like take that extra step further and kind of get people up and running without having to do as much thinking about authorization as we have.
For developers who are actually working on integrating OSO into their application and they're trying to figure out how to structure their policies and integrate it into their workflow, what is actually involved in starting to design a policy? How do you make it modular or be able to build abstractions over different policy components and just the overall process of maybe building a policy, debugging it, figuring out what's going wrong, sort of jumping into the Polar code itself to try and step through what's the actual logical process?
To put it simply, as much as possible, we want people to treat Polar just like application code. The policy files, they live in your application alongside your application codes. We also has a REPL and a debugger, so you can indeed set breakpoints in your policy file and jump in and kind of like interact with them and see what's going on. You can print things out so you can kind of see what information is being used as as it evaluates. And and the same applies to some of the other stuff you're asking, like how do you break up the files? How do you pull things out into like abstract rules or something like that? It's kind of very much the same approach you take with code. Like if you have a rule and it's getting a bit long and you see a common piece of logic shared across a bunch of different rules, then probably makes sense to pull it out and put it into its own rule. Again, I think some of that for authorization, we're trying to kind of codify as best practices in like examples. Like it can be something like roles is kind of abstract. So we're sort of giving people like, hey, here's how you can structure that policy. Here are the right abstraction of rules and how to split it up to make your life easier. But otherwise, it's kind of the same thing you do with normal code. Refactor it where appropriate. If you see the same pattern appearing 3 or more times, it's probably time to put it into a separate rule.
As to the specific type of application that you're working with, where maybe you're working on a web app in one place and maybe in another spot you're trying to build out a system daemon that's interacted via IPC calls, how does that influence the way that you think about defining policies or the types of permissions that you might need to work with?
I'd say we've primarily been focusing on kind of web apps. A lot of the patterns that we have and share, I think, are focused around that web application with things like roles. But a lot of the concepts really comes down to the same thing. It's trying not to think about authorization as being its own distinct concept that somehow is like independent of everything else that exists, but like as near as possible describe authorization in terms of what you already have and know about your app. So for example, the way that we kind of envision someone getting started with writing a policy in like a web app is just like start describing to us what you know about your app. What is your user model? Do you have like a user class? What are the resources you're trying to protect? I have an organization or a repository and a project or something. What are the relationships between them? Our repositories belong to organizations, and there's a key on there's an organization ID on a repository that is how you figure that out. Once you kind of like have built up some of those like pieces, it then actually becomes like very natural, I think, to just express what you're trying to do in terms of those. I've said these a bunch throughout, right? Like you can, user can read a repository if they're in the same organization as their repository or something, as the repository. So I think oftentimes people like try and wrap their heads around authorization models and what does RBAC and ABAC mean, when really it should just be how close can you get to describing the like natural language version of what you're trying to do? Can you express those concepts inside your policy language? And then can you just combine them together simply?
And as you work with end users of OSO and you try and iterate on the project itself, what are some of the common mistakes or areas of confusion that you see people run into as they're getting started with the project?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that I've seen as like an aha moment is when people wrap their heads around what it means for Polar to be a logic programming language or to be declarative. So for example, you don't need to like initialize a variable, you don't need to assign a value to a variable, you kind of just write in your rules what you want to be true. It's kind of the idea of declarative, right? Is you put down, here's what I want to be true, here are the rules that I want to be enacted in my application. This can be kind of counterintuitive because you can write like an allow rule, and the second parameter you can just put like the string reads, or the second parameter could be a variable action. And behind the scenes, like Polar is going to do sort of like pattern matching, this process called unification, where it's effectively going to be matching variables, and if the input variable is a read, then it will match both of these two things, otherwise it will match one of them. And the idea is like you don't need to tell OSO or Polar like how to do the thing, you just need to tell it what, and we work out the how. I think it can like take a little bit of time to get that sort of like aha moment to really click that that's the sort of workflow that you have in writing rules, and then kind of like seeing it happen. Because I think a lot of us are kind of geared towards thinking maybe more imperatively, like this will execute in this and this and this, as opposed to just like expressing, like I said, like I just want to express like there's a relationship between these two things. I now have this like piece that I'm going to use throughout my policy.
The other piece of sort of running into confusing bits is that people might decide, here's a feature that's useful, and then maybe use it as a crutch and not explore all of the capabilities of the framework. And I'm curious, what are some of the often overlooked or misunderstood capabilities of OSO that you think people should spend more attention on or be aware of as they're starting to explore the project?
One of the like most powerful things I think you can do with OSO is very fine-grained authorization that doesn't feel like overly complex. So I think a lot of people naturally want to gravitate towards doing like an authorization middleware, maybe on like the route level kind of thing. So inspecting the request that comes in and looking at the path and trying to answer whether that should be allowed or not, which can be very tempting because it means you get to just put like maybe authorization in one place at like this entry point to the application. But that can often be kind of restricting and make it harder to write some of these policies or require you like looking at redundant data. I think like the real power of OSO comes when you start like, seeing authorization as this like piece that's like lives throughout your system, throughout your application, and just like dropping in like the is allowed calls, like in, and all like the controller methods. Like if you have a piece of access, just like dropping in is allowed in there. And you can just pass in like, any resource. I mean, it could be a string, it could be a request, it could be an object, and you can write rules over those. Like not kind of constrain yourself to only having like one kind of authorization, but just like thinking about how it can be like woven in everywhere. I think that can be, yeah. So often we see people maybe get like stuck at like the first piece. They just, think about things on like the route level when really they could be doing, some really great stuff.
And that kind of plays into a bit of what we were talking about before with microservices, where I'm curious how you think about how to start to approach the design of policy definitions for a system as a whole when it's composed of different microservices, and being able to pass off the useful pieces of information for the different downstream policies to be able to key off of.
I'll start by explaining a piece of Polar or OSO that's useful for this. So one of the things that's nice about logic programming as a whole is you can generally ask it like flexible questions. So you can ask it, can a user read this resource? But you can also say, what are all the actions this user is allowed to perform on this resource? And it'll maybe give you like a list of those strings. So where this can be useful is it means you can start, sort of like annotating some of your data that gets returned by an API with like the user's capabilities on that resource. So maybe I have my repository service and I query it and I get back the repository data. But then I also get back like the list of all the things the user can do. I can now like plug that information into whatever other microservice I have, now the full like understanding. From that microservice's understanding, this is all the things the user can do on this repository. I'm a downstream consumer of repositories, and now I know that like I should or shouldn't allow, the user to create this branch or something. Maybe this is the Git service or something handling branch creation. You kind of now have all the information you need on like the permissions. In this world, you haven't had to like recouple the data sources because authorization does often try and touch like all parts of data, the idea is like you can still draw those like nice decoupled boundaries around your microservices by just allowing them to answer more flexible questions on authorization. I just think that's just something that hasn't really been explored enough as a design concept, and something that we're kind of looking to help support.
And that's starting to sound a little bit familiar too in terms of OAuth scopes, as far as this user is authenticated. Here is a token that they have created for, some third party to be able to perform these actions, whether that third party is likely to be another piece of software. And it sounds like OSO is kind of a natural fit for being able to design and implement those scope constraints within the application.
Yeah, absolutely. Adding like scopes on a token is another really interesting possibility. I think it can be very useful just for, this is maybe not like directly the same as their kind of original OAuth purpose, but I think around things like API tokens, maybe as a user of the app, you want to create a one-off, API token, but all it should be able to do is read. So you want to be able to like add that, restrict the permissions to just read actions. I think it can definitely be really useful in that kind of context, where you can maybe take what the existing user already has and then like restrict it down to like a smaller number of things.
And as you mentioned earlier, you're building this as part of a startup, and OSO itself is open source. So I'm curious what your overall product vision is as far as what you're going to monetize around, and how that relates to your overall governance strategy around the open source component of what you're building.
Everything I've spoken about today is part of the open source offering. And at least like 6 to 12 months is really on growing the open source community and adoption. The stuff we spoke about at the very beginning, we really just see there as like a huge opportunity and a huge chance for us to provide like a consistent way of doing authorization across like any application or language. So that's really where we're like focusing on now in the short term. Over the kind of the longer term, some of the stuff that we've spoken about doing as like a commercial offering would be effectively like supporting more of like an operational security pieces of doing authorization across like larger deployments. Something that we speak to with people about a lot is auditing, both internally and externally. Being able to say to, say like a customer or an end user, so-and-so was compromised and you want to know what they did. Yeah, here are all the resources they accessed over the last like 6 months. Or similarly, being able to ask questions like, what are all the resources this person has access to and why? Like, why do they have access to that? Oh, because, they have this such and such a role. So that's kind of like the external facing version, but also like internally, it can be very useful to be able to look back and see what requests were made, and not just like what, but like why. And that can be like tied back to the policy. So that's just kind of like an example. The kind of thing that we're looking to build into our sort of commercial offering is ways that, help extend those individual OSO instances running in the apps with like additional stuff. Often comes up around product security or operational stuff, things like that.
And so does the current state of OSO allow for that type of exhaust of the types of questions and answers that are being asked of the policy engine itself, and being able to log the interactions with the Polar language?
You can definitely like log the requests and capture the requests, but the kinds of things that would be, I think, difficult for someone to build on them by themselves right now would be like an efficient way to capture the why pieces. I think, for example, today you could log, what was the request, and maybe like, a hash of the policy. So you kind of have like a version of the policy effectively. With that information, you could like recreate the why that request was allowed. But some of the stuff that I think, we'd want to provide goes towards more of the like, what are all the resources this person can access? You're now getting into like searching over policy decisions, which could be a lot trickier.
Talking about things like being able to generate an audit trail of who has interacted with what resources, and being able to figure out what policy decisions were made and why, brings to mind the question of performance impact. And as you go down that road, that's something that I'm curious to understand a bit more, but also just in the current state of embedding this policy engine into your application, the types of overhead that it incurs, and the work that you're doing to measure and reduce the overall impact that it has on people who are embedding OSO within their applications.
So policy evaluations themselves, for a regular resource, typically take on the order of like several milliseconds. So I think on like a per request basis, that's like pretty acceptable. There's actually a lot more we want to do there. The main area where performance becomes like on the orders of magnitude where it really matters is around formally doing authorization over like batch amounts of data. So for example, if you want to be able to list all of the resources that someone has access to, In the naive case, you're fetching the whole database and going through each one and saying, can I read this one? Can I read this one? Can I read this one? And so on. That's the one where this gets really bad, because then that 1 millisecond becomes, 10 million milliseconds or something. So to address that, we have this feature called data filtering, where we actually are able to take the policy evaluation, and instead of just outputting a yes or no answer, we'll actually output like a set of constraints or expressions for what resources can be accessed. And then we have like adapters with things like Django and SQL Alchemy that will convert that into a query filter. With the same policy that you would use to answer these authorization questions, you can then go and filter your database by everything this user can see, for example. And that's where the performance really matters, because then you pushed it down to the SQL layer. It's just become a case of SQL where clauses as opposed to fetching all of the data. That's kind of like the main area we've invested in to make sure that this can stay performant over like the typical use cases you need.
Yeah, and that also brings up the specter of how you're designing the policy itself, because with the fact that you can look up attributes on objects that live within the host language, there's definitely the possibility of triggering an N+1 query case, or doing an expensive lookup on an object multiple times, or doing sort of the naive approach of looking up this attribute in this section of the policy block and then another attribute in the other policy block, where in Django, for instance, each of those attribute lookups is actually a SQL query. So I'm curious some of the potential edge cases that you've seen people run into that can cause some of those cascades of performance issues.
Yeah, that's definitely an area that's possible. There was kind of an early trade-off that we decided around how much we should try and solve that kind of problem versus how much we should, give the user the tools to solve them. In the general case, like if you're writing a regular policy over your attributes and methods, we try to be pretty transparent to what's happening under the surface, so you can, optimize as necessary, and that we're not like obscuring the details too much. Like if you have an N+1 problem, you can solve that by the same approach you take in your application. There's not like an opaque barrier to you understanding that. So that's kind of like in the general case. In the case of data filtering, that effectively isn't a problem, because everything you express over your objects is getting pushed into that like one evaluation in the database. So there's maybe some amount of work where you might, for example, like fetch a bunch of attributes about the user first and then use those to perform that query. But generally you can achieve everything you need to in like one or two queries.
As you have been building out OSO and introducing new people to it and working with end users, what are some of the most interesting or innovative or unexpected ways that you've seen it used?
Oh, there's quite a range. One of my favorites, just from a novelty perspective, we had a group of students from NYU who were doing this as like a class project. They actually built a poker app. So for playing, Texas Hold'em poker, it was using Polar to power the like hand scoring logic. So, to express things like, what a full house is, and, and using Polar, and use that as like the engine to power the app. So I think that's kind of one of the more fun sides of this. I think that's, one of the most novel ones I've seen. On the more maybe practical ones, I think there's someone who's building a sort of like a public key infrastructure tool that uses some pretty complex policies, and also using Polar as the way to expose the configuration of authorization and permissions to their end users. So, this is a tool which is primarily aimed at other engineers to build and set up this public key infrastructure. So there they just basically made the customization for their authorization just be powered by Polar. So they basically provided some of that out of the box, but then just it's kind of a blank slate where it's like, if you need to customize this, go ahead. You can write whatever policies you need. I think that's a really nice example of some of the stuff that we'd like to see happen more and more, like over the long term, is that this just becomes a kind of widely accepted way of expressing authorization in your app and other people's apps and so on.
It's definitely cool that they were able to just expose that policy language directly to end users and say, go nuts.
Yep, and not re-implement it themselves from scratch and so on. And yeah.
They didn't want to just translate it into YAML and then feed that into Polar?
Not quite.
And so in terms of your experience of building OSO and trying to grow the user base, what are some of the most interesting or unexpected or challenging lessons that you've learned in the process?
One of the things that's been pretty challenging and definitely rewarding in building OSO is that we've been interacting with so many different language and framework communities. So pretty early on, actually, we had someone who's very involved in like the authorization and permissions kind of implementation from the Django ecosystem, like join our community and gave us a ton of really interesting feedback on like the idiomatic way of doing it there and how to fit in with the ecosystem. But then, similarly, as we've been building out across different languages, the way that, OSO should work in Go is pretty different to how it works in Ruby. And so it's always very, very like interesting to have people who are way more experienced than I am in these other languages to kind of come and just help us understand like how they would expect it to work and like how these things would normally go, and just kind of like give me exposure, or give the whole team really exposure to all these different languages and frameworks. It's been a lot of fun.
And for people who are looking to increase the granularity or flexibility of their authorization policies in the applications that they're building or the systems that they're trying to design, what are the cases where OSO is the wrong choice?
So I think honestly, if your application is maybe something like a social media app, maybe it's like a B2C application, something like that, where you may be unlikely to have like a lot of complex logic, then it may be better off to skip the complexity of adding this additional solution. Like I think we're sort of optimizing for a certain level of complexity that I think is very typical in B2B applications. I wouldn't want like everybody out there to think suddenly that like authorization is, roles is something that they absolutely must add to every single application. I mean, like you use Twitter on a daily basis. I don't have a Twitter role or anything like that. I'm just a Twitter user and I can see a bunch of things. I mean, there are maybe times where social media can be interesting because there's maybe a lot of like graph-based authorization permissions things going on there. But I'd say like on the whole, if you're building something, maybe an e-commerce app or something like that, then your authorization concerns might not be that complex.
As you continue to build out the project and iterate on your product vision for go-to-market in your business, what do you have planned for the future?
So as I said, the thing I'm most excited about is the upcoming work we have on effectively giving you a declarative way to build and create roles into your application using Polar. I really think that's going to be pretty game-changing in how people engage with roles as a concept in their app. And I think from there, we're just going to kind of like keep building on top of that and adding things like, new different types of authorization modeling, new extensions to things like, relationship-based access, to, ways to do route level in an easier way, giving people more control and like APIs for how they, manage things like roles inside their app, integrating new piece of data. Like I think, today, authorization is kind of like this small kernel of an app, and we sort of like want to grow it out across all parts. So, end to end from, everything you need to build in UI to expose this to users, to the back end, to the database. Like we're going to start seeing OSO used across like the whole stack.
Are there any other aspects of the OSO project or authorization and system design for being able to enforce better security policies that we didn't discuss yet that you'd like to cover before we close out the show?
I guess like one of the other sort of longer term, maybe medium term things that we want to be doing with Polar, which I think is going to start really showing the benefit of the approach, is having things like built-in linting, validation, testing, stuff like that. Because I think once you have like, your effectively like a specification for your authorization written in Polar, there's a ton of like really cool things we can do with that. I'll start giving you advice around like, there's a resource that accidentally hasn't been protected, or like the logic is messed up and everybody can access this one thing. Like there's a lot of really cool you can start doing with that once you've kind of got it expressed in that standard form. I'm really excited about some of that as well.
And those, one of the things I had actually meant to ask about earlier is with the Polar language itself, what type of editor support is available for people who want to be able to get useful syntax highlighting or, any sort of error reporting or linting available for the actual policy specification?
We have some amount of like linting and warnings built into the language that will just print out in whatever language you're using. IDE support specifically, we have support for VS Codes. And actually, we just recently had a community member contributed Vim syntax highlighting as well. So those are 2 ones we support currently. I would absolutely love for us to have a language server implementation for Polar. I think there's a ton of really cool stuff we could do there. We have a lot to do.
the perennial problem.
The perennial problems, yes.
All right. Well, for anybody who wants to get in touch with you and follow along with the work that you're doing, I'll have you add your preferred contact information to the show notes. And so with that, I'll move us into the picks. And this week, I'm going to choose the movie Chaos Walking. I just watched that a couple of days ago, and it was actually very well done, very interesting, really sort of interesting concept of everybody being able to see each other's thoughts, just the types of social impacts that has as people trying to settle on a new planet and kind of, being unexpectedly exposed to this. So definitely really well done movie, good acting, good sort of concept. Something worth watching if you're looking for something to pass the time. And with that, I'll pass it to you, Sam. Do you have any picks this week?
So I've been playing a lot of the game Hades on the Switch. It's a really fun game because, I don't want to give too many spoilers away, but basically it's like a roguelike, but every single run through, basically, like a lot of the variables and strategy and stuff like that changes. So if you kind of enjoy, RPG style games where you kind of get to create a character, it's like that, but every character is only going to survive for like half an hour tops. And you get to build a brand new one and pick a complete different skill tree. If you like that kind of thing, which I definitely do, then it's a really fun way just to do character building again and again and again and again. It's also very convenient if you don't have tons of time to play, because you can kind of do a run through, as I said, in about half an hour and move on, unless you get stuck in the sort of just one more game loop.
That's the other perennial problem.
The perennial problem.
All right. Well, thank you very much for taking the time today to join me and share the work that you're doing on Oso. It's definitely a very interesting project and one that I plan to take a look at myself for my own projects. So appreciate all of the time and energy that you've put into helping developers build more secure applications. So thank you for that, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening. Don't forget to check out our other show, the Data Engineering Podcast, at dataengineeringpodcast.com for the latest on modern data management. And visit the site at pythonpodcast.com to subscribe to the show, sign up for the mailing list, and read the show notes. And if you've learned something or tried out a project from the show, then tell us about it. Email hosts@podcastinit.com with your story. To help other people find the show, please leave a review on iTunes and tell your friends and coworkers.